So what I'm going to discuss tonight is something that actually I was going to do last week, but I wasn't happy with where I was going with it. So I delayed it a week and I'm happy now. I'm happy. So a lot of people have been writing up that they find it difficult to get a really nice join on neckbands where they join the shoulder. If they put the neckband on and then sew up the last shoulder. And I totally get that. It is fiddly and it can be thick. So I wanted to address that tonight. I've got suggestions, okay? You can choose what you take, that this is the way I see it. And I thought I'd share them with you. So what we're aiming to do is to get thinner joins at the neck. And also somebody actually posted up, they made the baby bodysuit. Well, that has the same thing. It has bands and then you have to join the short seam. And again, they can be quite thick, especially if you've used the knit binder. So that's what I want to address tonight. And it doesn't matter whether you're using a serger to attach the band and just attaching a band with a serge stitch, or whether you're using the knit woven binder. The technique's the same for both. So let's have a look and see what we have. So what I'm going to do is I've got this on a slideshow. I sometimes think it's easier for you to see things. I have got a few pieces here. I'm not planning on demoing, but I can certainly show you things that I've got partly sewn and ready to demo. So let's get on to the slideshow, and then when I've gone through, I will look for questions. So we're dealing with these thick serge neckbands and leg bands, and I've got to say that really it's just, I'm just going to put, oh, my picture is there. See, I couldn't even see it. I'm just really talking about knits because I don't think it's such a huge problem with wovens, although it could be. And if it was, I would apply the same technique as I'm applying to knits. One thing I will say about knits is they don't fray. So that has an advantage to it too. Okay, so let's go on. You can see I've got a neckband here that I did earlier. And the method, as I said, it can be used on neckbands or leg bands, and it can be used whether you've serged it or whether you're using knit woven binder and cover stitch. So same technique. So how can we make that shoulder and neckband thinner? That's what we've got to look at. So this is how I view it. 3-thread overlock rather than 4. Now I really like 4-thread overlock from knits, but sometimes there's a time to compromise. And I think particularly on the shoulder and short seams, that 3-thread overlock is quite sufficient. Um, Entirely your choice, but if you use the 3-thread, you've got one layer less stitch. Okay, so that might help. And then the next thing I'm going to say is the knit woven binder. Um, I'm really I'm just about at the stage now where if I'm going to do a knit that has any substance, I'm going to use the single fold bias binder because it gets rid of another layer of fabric. Okay, and I'm going to show you how to hack your binders as well. So the next thing I would say, using a sewing machine on neckband seam allows you to open it up flat. If we serge it, we serge all the layers together. If we sew it on the sewing machine, we can open that neckband seam and press it open. And that's going to halve the amount of fabric either side of the neckband. So that's really where I'm going with this. For those of you that use woolly nylon, it's great, it's soft, but I feel it does make seams thicker. So another consideration. And finally, press, press, press. Press and use a clapper. Okay, this is a clapper, this wooden clapper. You put it on this, you steam your seam, you put this on it, the steam absorbs into the wood and it gets flatter. Okay, so I'm going to show you or substantiate those things. Let's try and move to the next slide. Right, the knit woven binder, the hack. You can, the 15mm doesn't come as a single binder. I think only the 10mm does, but this is the 15mm. And if you look at the picture, and I can show you off camera too, or off the slideshow, that I've slid a little piece of folded paper into the bottom of that binder. You can see it sticking out. And what that does is it stops that fabric from feeding into that fold. So on the inside, I don't have a fold. I have a fold on the outside where it needs to look pretty, but on the inside, I do have a raw edge, which is fine because my fabric isn't going to fray. So it's actually no need for it to be double, and it's going to give me a flatter. It's going to add to thinning that seam. So if you're going to do that, you're going to fold up a piece of paper, and it's about 1/4 of an inch wide, and it doesn't matter how long it is, as long as it blocks that fabric. You can see the fabric in the binder from going into that section. And of course, you're going to have to cut your binding narrower because you don't have that extra fold. And I have found 1/4 of an inch smaller works really well for me. Okay. The other thing I think really helps with this method is if you have excess neck binding. You know, when you sew your neck binding on, you don't know how much you're going to use, so you generally have a bit at the beginning and end. Now, I would leave that on, not cut it, because I think it just helps when you come to press it and fix it in place. So, as I said, I like to use a 4-thread overlock on knits, but I think for something like a shoulder seam, I don't see it as being essential. It's not got a lot of pressure on it, and I was quite happy to use a 3-thread overlock, and that just took out one thread, which made it thinner. And the next thing I'm going to do is press my serged shoulder seam towards the front. Now that's different to how we were taught to do it years ago, but they believe now that if you press it towards the front, the light doesn't catch it and it's not so obvious. I don't think it's a huge deal, but I thought I'd just mention that. So I pressed it, and I pressed it really well, and I pressed the seam towards the front, and I used my clapper because that's going to give me the really flat seam. And I press it first of all as it's sewn, and then I open it up and press it towards the front of the t-shirt. So you're going to attach your neckband. I haven't covered that. Goodness, I've done lots of lives on neckbands. I've done lots of classes on neckbands. There's plenty of t-shirt classes. My knits class tells you how to work with that. And of course, my double fold bias binder workshop, which I did fairly recently, tells you how you're going to attach the neckband to the t-shirt using the knit woven bias binder. Equally, you don't have to use it. It could just be serged, but I've said that already. So pressing is the key because it makes it flat. In fact, pressing is the key in all garment making. Um, and you can see there that I'm pressing over the ham, and you might also notice that I have a large burn mark on my ham. And I did think about getting a new one, but it's fine apart from that one mark. So what I do is I steam that neckband heavily, and then I just leave it sitting on that curved ham to dry. And I just want to hold my ham up. You can see it's kind of curved. It's perfect for necklines. The neckline goes across here. If it's a smaller one, it can go further down, whatever. But I leave it to dry. And I find all neckbands look so much better after you press them. And they're certainly easier to work with. So then I matched my shoulder seam with my neckband, right sides together, and I went to the sewing machine, and you can see that red dotted line. I just sewed from the top of the neckband about an inch down the shoulder on my sewing machine, okay, on my stitch line where my stitch line would be. And I think this is a good method because it allows you to open up the seam. So the next thing I did was I pressed it open using my clapper. And when I pressed it open, you can see that I've got some going to the front, some going to the back. And what I did was I think it's probably in the next slide, I top stitched down the seam that was heading towards the back. And you can see it in this photo. And by top stitching it down, it's just flattened it, it's got it out the way, it's not going to cause me any trouble. And I'm still working on the front seam, okay, that's not stitched down. So I've trimmed off my excess seam band at this time because I pressed it and so I don't need it anymore. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, you can see there's a pair of scissors, the point of some scissors there. Do you see where the scissor point is pointing? It's pointing to the seam allowance. And what I've done is I've cut my seam allowance. Let me say that I've turned that picture around. So I've cut my seam allowance on the back. I think that's wrongly marked. And I'm going to move it. No, sorry, let me think that over. Just below the neckband seam cut on the top of the back shoulder only. So on the back, which is the side that's actually top stitched, I've cut just below the neckband and I've folded that fabric over to meet the seam allowance on the front. Okay, so all the seam allowance is going to the front, apart from the neckband and that top 1/4 of an inch just there. Okay, so that's going to allow me to sew the shoulder seam now. So let's go to the next page. And I'm going to serge the shoulder seam, but I'm going to start at the end of the neckband. Okay, I'm going to start at the lower edge of the neckband. And I've left my thread chain there. Anybody that knows me well that knows that it'll probably be there forever. But actually, it was partly to show you where I started. So I started sewing just on that bottom seam of the neckband and sewed my shoulder seam. And what that meant was I didn't have a build-up of stitches on the neckband section, and I just find it easier. I mean, I don't have a problem with you serging all the way down from the top of the neckband, except to say it's really difficult not to get a build-up of stitches there. And I think there's no requirement for it. It's not essential. It's not going to fray. And I just sewed the rest of the seam, shoulder seam, from the bottom end of the neckband. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch that neckband top because that is just going to help it to be thinner. So let's look at the photo on the right there, and you can see I've top stitched both sides and it's super thin and it sat super flat. So let me just see where I'm going next. I'm just going to recap. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to me and I'm going to check for questions because I'm sure I'll have some. Okay. So what I think I'll do, I don't see it. Do you see any questions, Richard? He says no. Somebody speak to me. Oh, that shirt is the Tunic Bible. It's the shirt from one of the shirts from the Tunic Bible. Yeah, yeah. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move you onto camera so I can just briefly go through that again, showing you my samples. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move you onto this camera and my table. Right. Let's move me out of that section there. Right. So as I say, here is my ham. Here is my clapper. And you can get bigger clappers, but I really believe in them. You know, I really think they do make things flat. So what I have here is the one that I finished. So you can see that I've got my top stitch section there. And on this side, do you see how the thread chain starts at the bottom of the neckband? Because I just think it prevents that build up of stitches. And here's one that I did where I started at the top, okay? And I did exactly the same thing. I top actually yeah, I top stitched this side down, and this one I sewed from the very top. And even when I use what's it called when you put something under the foot to level it? You know what I mean? I put some fabric under there to level it, but I still always have trouble with that start. And so I do have a build up of stitches there. Does it offend me? No, but I think I can do better. And I think by starting further down, that allows me to do that. And in actual fact, this can just be threaded in and nobody knows it's there. But there's no doubt it adds thickness to the top of that seam. So here we have it. Just going to run through what I did. I pressed it well. I let's take that pin out. I stitched it on the sewing machine from the top of the band to about where that pin is. Okay, then I pressed it, I opened it up, I put the back band towards the back, and I top stitched from the right side on that back band. I haven't done it yet, but that's what I would do. And that leaves this side, okay? And what I need to do is I need to get this piece over to that side, which is the front. So I would just use my scissors, cut a little cut in there, and that allows me to fold that piece. I haven't stitched it, but if I had, over to that side and secure it down over there. Now, what I don't want to do is cut into both sides because that starts destabilizing the neck. But I think when you do that, I think it works just fine. I think with the top stitching and even top stitching the other side, it makes it nice and secure again. So I think it's a really great technique. It's not one I've taught before. It was one I worked on to try and find a way to help you with the thinner bands. And I think particularly on things like the baby's bodysuit, where you've got the joins on the legs, on the inside legs, so they are quite thick. I think this is super thin. Can you see how thin that is? It really does flatten it out. And if you wanted to make it even flatter, I could have top stitched again closer to the raw edge of that seam. So I'm going to come back round to me, make sure there are no questions. There are a few questions, says Richard. I've got my phone open so I can pick some up. Hump jumper, thank you, thank you. Richard said it's easier if I do it. I'll do it. I'm referring to the brindle and twig baby onesie when I sew the side seam with the sleeves with a band and the binding from the 15mm. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. Does this work with sleeve binding and binding on a baby onesie? Yes, it absolutely does. It doesn't matter whether you've sewn it on with a serger or you have used the knit woven binder. It's just being able to open up that big neck binding, sleeve binding, leg binding is going to divide the amount of fabric either side rather than having the whole lot turning to one side. So it's going to help you with anything like that. And even, a woven, it will help too. So, would you use the 1/4 inch slice of paper in a binder regardless of the size binder you're using? Um, I Just let me get mine off my machine. I think you might have. Yes, I think you would have. I think 1/4 inch would probably be the same for the smaller one too. Just make sure you get it into that little. I'm just undoing it from my machine. If I look as if I'm doing something strange. Just make sure you get it into that little slot at the bottom just to prevent the fabric feeding in. So here is my binder and here's my piece of paper. It's just folded and then I've just got it and I've slid it into that bottom section. Let's see if I've got my small one and I can check that for you. So that's going to stop any fabric from getting in there. Okay, I have the small one. Funnily enough, I already have a piece of paper in that one. But I'm I think I used a 1/4 inch, but it's yeah, it's slightly thinner. It's slightly thinner. But I really think the secret, the whole thing is just using single binders when you're doing neckbands and opening the seam. And there is no requirement to put those serger stitches at the top. You can start them at the bottom, which means it's just a whole lot easier. And you shouldn't get that build up of stitches. So it's going to give you a nice finish, I think. I'll just show you my finish again because it is nice. Okay, the thread tail's still on there, but you can see how nice and flat it is. You can see where I've folded back the fabric. Somebody said, would you show us something? But I can't find it. Would you use the caution? No. Just checking my questions. So just use paper and then cut the binding a bit narrower. Yes. And I find 1/4 of an inch is pretty good. Don't worry, if I see angry faces, I always think it's by accident, so don't worry. Okay, so Karen, I showed you how I put the paper in. It just slides into that bottom section. Okay, that's it on the small one. You're right. And that's it on the bigger one. And it's all it's doing is stopping that fabric from feeding into that bend so that it doesn't create a fold on the lower level. Oh, and let me just show you what it looks like, because perhaps I didn't show you that enough. But you see, it's just not folded under, but that makes it thinner. You know, it works really well.